Hello, my name is Sasha Prokhorov. I'm the director of Russian and Post-Soviet Studies program. Welcome to the 2019 Gregory Tepper lecture series. This lecture series is made possible because of support and munificence of William and Mary alum and donor Gregory Tepper. Before the introduction of today's speaker, we would like to thank him for his generosity. Thank you. This year's theme is Empire and Memory. When we talk about the empire, we mean both hereditary and Soviet socialist empires. And our first lecture today is titled Stalin's Master Narrative and deals with the discourses of the Soviet Empire. So let me introduce our illustrious speaker, David Brandenberger. David has written on Stalin's era propaganda, ideology, and nationalism in journals like Russian Review, Slavic Review, Revolutionary Russia, Nationality Papers, Europe-Asia Studies, Jahrbucher für Geschichte Osteuropas, Новейшая история России and Вопросы истории. His first book, National Bolshevism, focuses on the USSR's reliance on Russocentric mobilizational propaganda and the effect that this pragmatic use of historical heroes had on national consciousness among Russian speakers. His second book is an interdisciplinary study titled Epic Revisionism, Russian History and Literature as Stalinist Propaganda. It elaborates on many of the themes listed in the title in its examination of Stalin regime's co-option of canonical classics from Pushkin, Karamzin maybe, Lermontov to Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible. His third book, Propaganda State in Crisis, explores the USSR's failure to inculcate a sense of communist identity in interwar Soviet society. His fourth book, Stalin's Master Narrative, is a co-edited critical edition of the General Secretary's infamous 1938 party history book, textbook. He's presently writing a book on the 1949 Leningrad affair, Stalin's last political purge, and co-editing the Purge-era diary of a high-ranking member of the USSR's Politburo. Please help me to welcome Professor David Brandenberger.
So it looks like I'm mic'd up. We teach such small courses at the University of Richmond that I don't ever work with a microphone, so this is going to be fun. Before I begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to Sasha and Lena Prokhorov, the Gregory Tepper Lecture Committee, and of course the College of William and Mary for inviting me to give this lecture. It's quite exciting, and I'll explain to you why it's actually personally exciting in just a moment. So Stalin's Master Narrative is the topic of the talk. It's also this new publication of mine. You have it here, all 700 pages of it. Stalin's Master Narrative is a critical edition of the 1938 short course on the Bolshevik Party history. It's a Stalin-era textbook that was designed for mass consumption and indoctrination and published in 1938. Joseph Stalin, it turns out, not only commissioned the book to be written, but he edited it himself. Because the short course was officially advertised as being compiled under the supervision of a Central Committee Commission, you can see it right there in Russian on the title page of the book, this book immediately became the canonical text in the Soviet Union when it was published in September 1938. It's the key to absolutely everything. Much like Mao's little red book in Chinese history. The short course then remained at the center of party ideology and propaganda until Khrushchev denounced it at his secret speech in 1956. Before the short course was withdrawn from circulation, approximately 40 million copies of the book were published in over a dozen languages, making it one of the most frequently published books in the 20th century. As immodest as it sounds, it's no exaggeration to say that this is Stalin's master narrative, the short course. It's a master narrative on both party and state history in the USSR between 1917 and 1938, but also includes pre-revolutionary history of the Bolshevik movement. As such, it scripted not only party indoctrination and propaganda, but depictions of Soviet history in mass culture, theater, literature, film, and even in the showcases of the country's many museums. So it has an enormous mass cultural impact in addition to a straightforward ideological impact. During the post-war period, the short course was also used as a blueprint for state building and this sort of instruction in the new people's democracies of Eastern Europe, and after 1949 in the People's Republic of China. Withdrawn from circulation in 1956, the short course nevertheless enjoyed quite an afterlife. Even after disappearing from bookshelves and party history syllabi in the Soviet Union, the short course structured the Bolshevik and state history and remained essential to the core of, I guess, what I'm calling the official narrative of Soviet party and state history until the early Gorbachev period. So it had a really long afterlife, almost longer than its current life between 38 and 56. Outside the USSR, the short course continued to shape party and state building activities in the People's Republic of China through the 1970s. So it remained in circulation in China longer than in the Soviet Union. Outside the communist bloc, the short course also enjoyed a long afterlife after 1956, playing a central role in many critiques of Stalin and Stalinism, and it serves to the present day in many quarters as sort of the epitome of dogmatic thought. Today I'd like to lay out for you and give you the results of a long research project. In some senses, it was something that I was involved in, but it's probably better to say that it was an obsession of mine for about 12 years. It's something that I co-authored with a leading Russian historian who works at the archive where I work in Moscow, the former Central Party Archive. His name is Mikhail Zelenov. And this project lasted about 12 years and culminated earlier this year in the production of the book itself. So it's exciting for me to be able to show it to you today and give you one of the first talks I've given on the book in a way to give you a preview of what it is. In fact, this is only the second talk I've ever given on the book. The first one was at the Central Party Archive in Moscow. So we'll see what you think. What I'd like to do is begin with historiography and then give you a shift to a history of the project and then some content analysis. And ultimately what I'd like to do is identify for you several reasons why Stalin should not only be considered Lenin's best pupil and the father of the Soviet peoples and the genius of mankind, but more seriously one of the most influential Soviet historians in the 20th century. It's not the title that he would have chosen for himself, but I think it's true both before and after 1953. So let me begin with a little bit of historiography on the issue. Commonly referred to by Soviet historians, wow, that echoes. Commonly referred to Soviet historians as the encyclopedia of Bolshevism during Stalin's reign up through 1956, we can think about the first real critic of this textbook, the short course, as being Nikita Khrushchev, who, as I've already mentioned, denounces the book in 1956 as he is in the process of denouncing his former mentor, Joseph Stalin, at the 20th Party Congress. Using the short course to demonstrate Stalin's immodesty, Khrushchev connected many of the book's idiosyncrasies to his predecessor's ostensibly craven need for recognition and self-aggrandizement. The short course for Khrushchev was a central element of Stalin's cult of personality, which he considered responsible for the worst excesses of the time period. So there's a one-to-one relationship between Stalin, the short course, and everything wrong in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's speech proved formative for almost all subsequent thought on the short course, both at home and abroad. Boris Ponomaryov, a major Khrushchev-era historian, and much of the establishment that surrounded him, moved right in step with Khrushchev in the years following 1956 to denounce this text for the way that it ossified party history and Marxist-Leninist theory. Outside of the communist bloc, the short course was also regarded as a prime example of everything that was wrong with Marxism-Leninism. Sovietologists such as Leonard Shapiro, Paul Averich, and Sidney Ploss published analyses in the 1960s and 70s that closely followed Khrushchev's criticisms of the text, almost one-to-one again. Robert C. Tucker from Princeton University went further to contend that the short course was nothing short of an indoctrinational mechanism for Soviet society. But not satisfied with that critique, Tucker went even further and suggested that the short course should be read as Stalin's own autobiography. It was known after Khrushchev's secret speech that Stalin had meddled with the text, and so Tucker says it's an autobiographical text. According to Tucker, and this is a very famous book from 1973, Stalin suffered from a chronic inferiority complex and rewrote party history around himself as sort of a therapeutic device to demonstrate to himself, as much as to everybody else, how much he actually deserved this sobriquet of Lenin's best pupil. Not to be outdone, other Sovietologists and in some senses even intellectual historians followed Tucker and continued this connection of Stalin, the personality cult, and the short course. Even such esteemed intellectual historians as Leszek Kolakowski and Andrei Walitsky denounced the turgid short course as epitomizing totalitarian thought writ large. After Khrushchev's fall from grace in 1964, Soviet historians observed a rather unofficial taboo on the whole subject of the short course until the beginning of the glasnost period under Gorbachev. So there's approximately 22 years of a taboo on the short course. Westerners continue to talk about it and criticize it, but Soviet historians observe a taboo under Brezhnev's reign. Gorbachev gives new permission for this sort of criticism under glasnost starting in 1987. And so in 1988, we have the beginning of a new wave of publications about the short course when the senior Communist Party historian Maslov publishes a number of critiques in a number of different publications about the short course. He was given very early archival access to some of the drafts of the short course. And unsurprisingly, I guess, even though Maslov had access to a new run of material from the historical database that is the Central Party Archive, he ended up with the same conclusion that Khrushchev did as part of the personality cult. General Dmitry Volkoganov, who was Yeltsin's advisor and was an early controversial biographer of Stalin, Lenin, and then Trotsky, also got access to the same material and also arrived at the same Khrushchevian conclusion that this is a sign of the personality cult more than anything else. True, Volkoganov went a little bit further and coined the phrase encyclopedia of dogma to I don't know, as sort of a stand-in for the short course. But in all actuality, he didn't stray too far from the Khrushchevian line. Even the famous dissident historian Medvedev effectively repeated Khrushchev's criticism even after the start of the glasnost period. Such a historiographical survey demonstrates two things, I think. First, it demonstrates that after I guess it demonstrates first and foremost this long afterlife that I was talking about the short course. That after 1956, it continues to affect both criticism and perhaps even the structuring of Soviet history on either sides of the aisle through the late 1980s at least. Moreover, it indicates that much of the existing criticism of the short course is actually rather methodologically suspect. It rather uncritically repeats what Khrushchev had to say without trying to work anymore with the historical edifice that was becoming to be available in the Central Party Archive in the late 80s, and this would continue into further discussions of the short course in the 1990s. So historians keep on coming back to Khrushchev's hyperbolic, rather politicized denunciation of the short course without thinking too much more carefully about it. Indeed, many of these short course commentators seem to have been more influenced by Hannah Arendt, George Orwell, and Psychiatry's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, than by the historical record itself. So that provided Mikhail Zelnov and I with a premise to revisit this question. In fact, this problematic historiography is probably what he and I both trace our initial interest in a major joint project to. We were talking about it quite a bit in the sort of the early about a decade ago, 12 years ago. And both of us observed how thin and uncritical this historiography was. Both of us saw the opportunity to do a major project, sort of a end-all and be-all and end-all definitive study of the short course. So that's what we decided to do together. The other justification for this work was sort of a corollary to that observation about the weak historiography. It was that even though it's been widely known for a long time the massive role that the short course had both in the formation of Stalinist historiography and anti-Stalinist critique, very little was known about its actual genealogy or evolution. So Zelnov and I therefore designed this Stalin's Master Narrative project as a critical edition that would first contextualize this notorious text within the context of the 1930s, and then quantify and classify Stalin's interventions into history itself. In so doing, we hoped that Stalin's master narrative would resolve once and for all precisely what role Stalin played in interpolating into and excising from this all-important book. Successful analysis of the short course, in turn, would allow Stalin's master narrative to characterize with unprecedented precision the General Secretary's efforts to shape historical imagination and memory in the Soviet Union. Along the way, we also hoped that the critical edition would provide unparalleled insight into Stalin's own understanding of party history, both in a holistic sense and in terms of important trends, key events, and decisive individuals. So like I said earlier in my quick introduction, insofar as this edition has yet to be reviewed, I'm going to invite you to take part in sort of an evaluation of whether you think that I've proven my case or not, because I admit this is a pretty hefty agenda. So essentially what happened, 12 years ago, Zelenov and I began this project. And we began by first systematically combing the Moscow and Petersburg archives, looking for the paper trail associated with the formation of the short course. As I'll get into the history of the text in a few minutes, this is a paper trail that stretches back to the late 1920s, early 1930s, so it is an awful lot of material. So we combed through the relevant party holdings, which center in the former Central Party archive, but also include the former current archive of the Central Committee, the former Moscow Party archive, and a prominent pre-war military archive. We identified material important to our investigation, and then we attempted to synthesize it together to form a coherent chronological framework. Some of this work was straightforward, in as much as many of the documents were properly dated and cataloged. It turns out that the Soviet Union saved absolutely everything that Stalin came in contact with, especially during his period in office, but then even after his death and denunciation. Everything that could be saved was saved, and so this produced, of course, a nightmare in terms of the proportion of paper trail that we had to deal with, but at least most of it was well cataloged. Other bits and pieces, though, of this story were undated or miscatalogued, particularly correspondence, administrative directives, and thousands of pages of early drafts of the short course, as you can imagine. So in the end, it took us the better part of 10 years to come up with a summary record of all of Stalin's editorial interventions into the text. And we ultimately had to do this through a careful comparison of the prototype, which was developed for Stalin and delivered to him in April 1938. And we compared that prototype to the version of the text which was actually released in September of 1938. That allowed us to create a summary text of the sorts of material that contributed to this critical edition. In the end, so basically, Stalin's interpolations in this critical edition are represented in italics. There. It's a little bit more visible, probably not for all of you, but you can see that not only there are italics littered across the page, that's Stalin's interventions into the text, what he interpolated into the text, and then the distracting strikeout is actually Stalin's own decisions as to what material did not belong in the text, what he removed from the text. Zelenov and I decided to design the book so graphically in order to, in a sense, capture some of the violence with which Stalin attacks this thing. A summary record of the General Secretary's interventions into party history, Stalin's master narrative records not only records basically only the edits that Stalin made that actually made it into print. Intermediate drafts and abortive editorial changes are not reflected in this edition. Why is that? It is a compromise of sorts, I will admit. Nevertheless, this is what Zelenov and I decided had to happen, at least for the English language edition, about 5 years ago. The reasons for this are threefold. First of all, Yale University Press, our beloved publisher, gave us a contract for 500,000 words. 500,000 words is 4 monographs, I guess. It's a very generous contract, but not generous enough to accommodate extensive appendices or footnotes. So we were limited by the scale of what Yale was willing to work with. Second of all, format. Yale wanted an edition. It's in the Annals of Communism series. And they wanted an edition which was accessible for undergraduates, graduate students, and knowledgeable but perhaps non-specialist audiences. So we couldn't design a text which would include lots of exotic orthography. We couldn't accompany this with a massive scholarly apparatus. And so in some senses, we designed a book which was designed to be read by large audiences. Not as large as the original short course, but larger audiences. Third, Zilanoff and I discovered during our research that the short course's archival paper trail is certainly very rich, uncommonly rich perhaps, but not complete. Many of the chapters of the short course lack intermediate drafts, and several are missing so much material that it's proven nearly impossible to reconstruct Stalin's actual editorial process. Ultimately, then, these factors led Zilanoff and me to conclude that this version should be a summary text, a critical edition of the summary text, rather than a play-by-play, which would account for the editorial process itself. We hope to produce a more layered, comprehensive record of Stalin's interpolations and excisions when the Russian version of this text comes out in a few years. That edition will probably run close to 1 million words rather than just 500,000. It's a nightmare project, but I guess it'll keep me out of trouble. So what are the key findings of the text? Let me begin with the history of the book. The short course's origins date back to the late 1920s, when the party leadership expressed frustration over the lack of a single party history, a sort of a monopolistic party history that could be used for party catechism. Stalin spurred this search for a usable past forward in 1931 while he wrote his famous letter to Proletarskaya Revolutsiya. This is a scholarly journal in Soviet ideology, in which Stalin complained about the overly scholastic nature of party history up until 1931 and explained that he thought it was really necessary to show word and deed. He wanted existing party histories to be revised or re-released in order to produce a more accessible catechism for mass indoctrination and mobilization. In the end, despite official support and consultations, it took party historians the better part of 6 years to design and produce even a minimally acceptable party history. It was ultimately written by Yaroslavsky and Pospelov, who are captured here in the image. They had a third partner, Wilhelm Knorren, who joined them by party decree in April of 1937. He was purged in June of 1937, so of course his name never figures on the title page of the resulting edition. But so these two party historians with a whole array of assistants at the Marx-Engels Lenin Institute in Moscow produce a minimally acceptable text which they delivered to Stalin in April of 1938. What's interesting, though, is at this point, even though Stalin's been involved in at least the proofing process, the vetting process of the short course up through this point, Stalin takes a good look at it in April of 1937 and announces that it is absolutely unsatisfactory, that it cannot possibly go forward. Stalin refuses to authorize the book's release. He also refuses to give it back to Yaroslavsky and Pospelov to try again. He figured that they had already had their shot. They had already gone through 4 complete drafts of the text. And so Stalin decides himself to rewrite the short course during the summer and early fall of 1938. So it's released in Pravda in the early days of September 1938 and then comes out in a hardback book shortly thereafter. Note that this is the very height of the Stalin terror. So he takes time aside, looks like the better part of a month and a half he takes during the summer of 1938 in order to rewrite the party catechism. In terms of textual analysis, let me start with a bit of literary analysis on Stalin's editing before we get to content. So what does a literary analysis of the short course produce? Stalin's interventions into the text are best thought of as consisting of several different categories. First, it's worth mentioning that Stalin was a compulsive editor and read reports, draft legislation, and even books with a pencil or chemical crayon always in hand. He couldn't resist. He proofed as he read, and he read as he proofed. He was pedantic about terminology and preferred formal, sober writing. He disliked flowery language as well as all sorts of literary devices. Most commonly, what he would remove from the text that we're talking about today is literary devices like foreshadowing. He referred to all this as literaturщина, sort of the pernicious influence of literature on important didactic tracks. So he tried to strike all of that as he was beginning his editing process. Second, Stalin was concerned with the clarity of writing intended for mass audiences and insisted that the short course's narrative be tightly structured around a handful of key themes. Stalin is, we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later as well, Stalin perhaps wasn't much of a party philosopher, but he was a terrific synthesizer and popularizer of party ideology. And so to this extent, he had a certain sense as to what audiences could tolerate and what they couldn't. And so that's why he's interested first and foremost in an accessible text for mass audiences. This led Stalin to strike huge amounts of detail, lengthy digressions, and even entire subsections of text out of the short course that was delivered to him by Yaroslavsky and Pospelov in order to design something that was more linear and would be more reflective of the most important priorities in the text. Third, if Stalin was concerned about the writing of the short course, he was even more concerned about its central theme, its red thread, if you'll pardon the pun. And so Stalin's court historians, when Stalin's court historians delivered to him the prototype of the short course in April 1938, they had structured this text, and this is a good example of Stalin's editing on the first page of the conclusion of the book. When Yaroslavsky and Pospelov delivered this text to him in April of 1938, they had structured this text around a very predictable party narrative, a narrative of Bolshevik history, which argued that the Bolsheviks were the only true party of the worker-peasant masses. And this was true not only in Russia or the Soviet Union, but was true throughout the world. It was the only legitimate, true Marxist-Leninist party in the world. Party history, as a result, was defined both by its work with the peasant masses, its struggle with the opposition, and the perseverance of the party leadership in leading both of these struggles. First of all, the struggle to revolutionize society, build socialism, and also the struggle with the opposition. Indeed, the Bolsheviks only prevailed in this struggle, according to Yaroslavsky and Pospelov, because Lenin and Stalin were intimately associated with and constantly in contact with the masses. Had they not been in contact with the masses, they wouldn't have had the savvy necessary to continuously adapt Leninism to suit the needs of the day. When Stalin rewrote the text, he exaggerated the vanguard nature of the Bolshevik party. The vanguard nature is the advance guard nature of the party. It's a much more top-down sort of idea than the synthesis of top-down and bottom-up influence. And at the same time, Stalin reduces the level of dependence of the Bolshevik project on those worker-peasant masses. Stalin also downgraded the struggle with the opposition during the summer of 1938, despite his earlier support for this theme. So Yaroslavsky and Pospelov had, of course, shown him the text since mid-1937. He had approved it each time, but now he says, no, the struggle with the opposition isn't the key issue. Instead, what he argues, and this is in some sense because the purges are beginning to wind down during the second half of 1938, he suggests that now the struggle should be the struggle for building socialism in one country. That is the dominant theme. It is no longer the theme of the struggle with the opposition. It's the struggle to build socialism in one country and the struggle to unify society. Even more surprisingly, in order to stress the role of the party vanguard in Bolshevik history, Stalin even went so far as to reduce his own role in the narrative in order to reassign some of the agency that Yaroslavsky and Pospelov had assigned to him to Lenin and to the Central Party apparatus. I'll say more about Stalin's de-emphasis of his own personal contribution to party history in a few minutes. So as we shift from this literary analysis to more content analysis, it's worth asking what Stalin's edits to the short course reveal. What sorts of changes to the narrative? Let me point to 6 major junctures in the history of the party that were affected by Stalin's editorial interventions, while also dangling out for you the idea that I've only scratched the surface. There is an awful lot left to work on this text, and in some senses I think that's why Yale was willing to publish it the way it is, because this is something that many people will see. Many people will see various things in this text that I've missed or that I've chosen just simply for interests of time to not research on my own. All right, so the first area of analysis would have to be 1917. Stalin's understanding of 1917 is something that he was very well spoken on and publicly had spoken on in Soviet society since 1917. So by 1938, there's a big paper trail. Stalin's understanding of 1917 turns out to have undergone quite a profound transformation over this 21-year period. During the early years of Stalin's experiments of the Soviet experiment of the 1920s, Stalin espoused a conventionally Leninist point of view, in which 1917 was a revolution in which domestic events in the Soviet Union, or in Soviet Russia at that time, were contextualized within an international context. It was very much a domestic revolution, but within an international context. It reflected international tensions, it reflected the war, it reflected imperialism. It also reflected a leadership, in the classical Leninist sense, 1917 reflected the leadership of the party combined with very necessary input from the grassroots level by workers, peasants, youth, women, ethnic minorities, and so on and so forth. In fact, it's probably the most distinctive aspect of Stalin's early thoughts of 1917 that he regarded nationality to be almost as important as class in terms of the way that the revolution was accomplished. Without the revolt of non-Russian peoples, without militancy in non-Russian areas, the revolution might not have come to pass. So that's Stalin's contribution. Yaroslavsky and Pospelov, when they're putting together their prototype between July of 1937 and April of 38, basically reproduce this narrative for Stalin. Because they know what he's been saying all these years, they figured that this is going to be fairly straightforward. When Stalin interacts with their text, however, it turns out that Stalin's changed his mind about what 1917 means on a number of rather important levels. He rewrites the narrative. You can see this is his style of editing. He doesn't, every so often he'll use a new fresh sheet of paper, but he actually prefers to write on top of the page proof that he's offered, which I guarantee you is a delight to try and make sense of. This is where my work with Zelenov was absolutely irreplaceable because without Zelenov, I simply couldn't have managed it. It's so difficult to work out the ins and outs of this thing that it's much more helpful to have two people sitting next to each other trying together to do this guesswork as to what this scribble means. But when Stalin turned to editing the short course and picked up the chapter in 1917, he essentially rewrote the narrative, transforming this revolution of workers of the world into almost exclusively a Russian revolution, realized from above by the Central Bolshevik Command. Activism, whether on the part of workers, soldiers, peasants, women, youth, or non-Russian minorities, was downgraded or deleted. Local party organizations were likewise left to languish. Proletarian internationalism and the larger global context of 1917 also gave way to a new stress on autarky first and foremost, and the construction of socialism in one country on a second level. Of course, third, but in some senses as important as the other two, is the celebration of the vanguard party. So this is now an absolutely top-down history with even very little interreferentiality or resonance coming from the grassroots. It's really a completely new approach to writing 1917, but of course one that has absolutely lasting implications. The second level of content analysis that I'd like to offer you is on the subject of Soviet internationalism. Internationalism, as I've already sort of hinted, was a core element of early Bolshevik propaganda, and despite the leadership's growing pragmatism after the October 1917 revolution, the concept remained key to party self-identification and party representation in propaganda. The prototype short course prepared by Yaroslavsky and Pospelov between July of 37 and April of 38 delivered precisely this image, containing many of the traditional hallmarks of Soviet internationalism and spending a considerable amount of time detailing the global context of October 1917 and the socialist construction that followed it. The international revolutionary movement received considerable attention as well, as did the Comintern and its leadership of foreign communist parties. Finally, the conspiracies that threatened the survival of the Bolshevik regime and its efficacy later on in the 1930s were likewise tied to global events. That is, specifically, these conspiracies were given a global dimension insofar as oppositionists at home, whether former Bolshevik or former Menshevik or SR or Kulak, were all tied into a large international conspiracy of capitalists, imperialists, and fascists abroad. So Yaroslavsky and Pospelov linked them all together in a sort of a globalism which provides maybe the opposite side of the coin to the positive sense of Soviet internationalism. Stalin rejects this traditional stress on internationalism and reframes much of the history of the party and state in sui generis terms, stressing the Russianness of the revolution and the autarkic nature of socialist construction in line with his doctrine of socialism in one country. This turn away from the global nature of the revolutionary movement was matched by a radical reduction in the amount of attention cast towards the Comintern. This was the international arm of the Bolshevik-sponsored world communist movement. Here you can see, and this isn't terribly graphic insofar as it's so elegantly done, you have subchapter 6 on the 7th Congress of the Comintern from 1935. It's an important Comintern conference. This is where the Popular Front is devised. He's removed the whole thing. It just drops out of party history completely. It doesn't even leave a skeleton of mention of this important Comintern Congress, nor the stance against fascism, nor the new symbiosis of work on the political left in Europe. So it's a huge turnabout. Even the international dimensions of the struggle with the opposition, which had been one of the defining characteristics of party history in the prototype text, were also revised at Stalin's hands. Although Stalin didn't entirely eliminate the connection between domestic anti-party conspiracies and foreign imperialists abroad, he did reduce the level of this international coordination and command and control, something that rendered the oppositionists at home more homegrown, more isolated, and more disorganized, and the nature of the party's struggle more domestic than international. The next of my areas of analysis for you focuses on the national question. I've already mentioned that this was Stalin's forte. He was an early commissar of nationalities after 1917, and nationality policy was considered to be Stalin's major contribution to early Bolshevik thought and administrative elan. Stalin repeatedly asserted, as I've mentioned just now, that after 1917, the revolution should be considered emancipatory not only in class terms, but also in ethnic terms. In 1938, however, a combination of factors leads Stalin to downgrade the historical priority of the national question as well. More important in Stalin's eyes was the construction of a streamlined, unified, top-down historical narrative that would reinforce the authority and agency of the Central Party apparatus. In other words, Stalin had decided that the short course was not meant to tell the story of a multicultural struggle or a diverse society or the struggle for a diverse but egalitarian society, especially not something that's built from the grassroots up. Instead, the short course was to celebrate the determination of a monolithic vanguard party to overthrow the old regime and build socialism in one country. In this set of edits, which is next to the Comintern deletion, you see a subchapter 5, which is the great friendship of the peoples of the USSR. Stalin has marked a couple of score marks in the corner, and in the illegible writing here, you see him saying, this chunk should go in the chapter on the Soviet Constitution. Never wrote that chapter, though, so it drops out of party history entirely. So that's the national question. Now to the Great Terror, which is something that you may be almost most familiar with, or this might be your first association with Stalin. The Great Terror between 1937 and 1938, which claims the leading lights of the party, which decapitates the Red Army, which hits the Soviet intelligentsia and technical intelligentsia very hard, and even takes casualties from the population itself. Yaroslavsky and Pospelov were writing their prototype party history during the Great Terror, and in many senses the prototype turns out to be an absolutely representative, that is Pospelov and Yaroslavsky's narrative turns out to be very representative of that time frame. It's an absolutely paranoid, claustrophobic vision in which domestic opportunists and capitalist holdovers collude with foreign imperialists to undermine the construction of socialism in the USSR. Plots and dirty dealing abound. There's a ton of detail on traitors and people who are unmasked as traitors. And these plots abound from 1917 forward. So it's this two-decade struggle to weed out opposition within the party that's narrated by Yaroslavsky and Pospelov. According to these two very qualified party historians, by 1937-38, there was a massive, omnipresent conspiracy in Soviet society which united a very unlikely alliance of leftists, of rightists, of bourgeois nationalists, all working under the umbrella of a coordinated assault by international capitalist fascist imperialists. Yeah, this is what the newspapers in 1938 looked like. If you're looking at the results of the Bukharin trial, it's an absolutely paranoid, claustrophobic vision of Soviet society. And so this is reproduced in the text which lands on Stalin's desk in April of 1938. Now, although Stalin had supervised the construction of this narrative, he rejects it during the summer of 1938, something that I think is indicative of the fact that he was beginning to have second thoughts about at least the ultra-conspiratorial, omnipresent threat nature of the Great Terror and of these conspiracies that ostensibly abounded in Soviet society. As Stalin edited the short course, he reduced attention in the textbook to this omnipresent conspiracy. He disentangled domestic oppositionists from domestic capitalist holdovers. So therefore, if in the original prototype text, Bukharin and Rykov, two party dissidents, had been in direct communication with kulaks who were supposedly undermining agriculture and collectivization, in the short course that Stalin edits, he breaks those bonds. He sort of disentangles that conspiracy in a way which makes Bukharin and Rykov, the former dissidents, look rather impotent. And it also makes the kulaks, these peasant resistors, look absolutely politically isolated and without a vision for the future. At the same time, Stalin reduces the level of contact and coordination between domestic opposition groups and their foreign paymasters. He doesn't completely destroy those linkages, but he loosens those linkages, which of course end up making the domestic opposition look a lot weaker, a lot more disorganized, and a lot more chaotic. In this section of editing, you can see Stalin has rather viciously removed a whole chunk talking about the foreign paymasters who are running the opposition. And those paymasters are specifically connected over here to Trotskyites, who are also beginning to drop out of the picture. In general, he removes about 10,000 words of the text devoted to the Great Terror, just simply reducing the focus with which the latter chapters in the text dwell on this era of party history. In the end, these changes transform the prototype's imminent existential threat of all-power omnipresent conspiracy into a less concrete, more abstract menace. Stalin also rolled back the immediacy of the conspiracy by decoupling it from specific crises involved in Soviet industrialization and agricultural collectivization, meaning that and suggested that any terroristic plots already underway in the Soviet Union had been essentially brought to a halt and arrested by the tail end of the Great Terror. So in other words, the conspiracy and the plots and the paranoia that Yaroslavsky and Pospelov were projecting as continuing to the future, Stalin begins to taper off in his own narrative, saying these things are more or less done circa summer of 1938. Put another way, if the red thread of the prototype short course had been the party's all-out struggle with the opposition, Stalin attempted in 1938 to reduce the primacy of this struggle and instead change the primary struggle over to, yes, you guessed it, the construction of socialism in one country and the attempt to unify society rather than divide it through this hunt through this witch hunt. All right, so the next of my themes, and I'm nearing my conclusion, but the coming threat of war is a big deal in this text. It's published, after all, during the Sudetenland crisis of 1938, before Munich. It also, I think I can tie it directly to, or at least indirectly, to the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, which was just commemorated a month ago. In late August. Stalin's revisions to the text regarding the imminent threat of war during the late 1930s is also something that's very consequential for the meaning of this text. Yaroslavsky and Pospelov had designed their prototype party history between 37 and 38 to reflect a claustrophobic sense of danger for the USSR and the world socialist movement. A threat stemming from the structural contradictions of the USSR's location within a capitalist encirclement. It was said to have been catalyzed by the Great Depression, which panicked capitalist countries. The Great Depression had ostensibly panicked capitalist countries into brutally suppressing the working class at home, and in Germany and France and Britain, so on and so forth, and it had driven imperialism into a new stage of development as well, because London and Paris and Berlin are in a panic over the Great Depression. This, according to Yaroslavsky and Pospelov, led to domestic repression in Germany, civil war in Spain, Japanese intervention in China, and an imminent threat of war against the USSR. Stalin reverses this argument too when he revises the short course. Stressing the USSR's commitment to peace and national defense, he argued that the Soviet society was much less subject to the threat of impending invasion than Yaroslavsky and Pospelov had suggested. According to Stalin, although a Second Imperialist War had already begun, this is 1938, not 1939, so even though the imperialist countries were already effectively at war with each other, this was a war between capitalist powers and didn't pose an imminent or existential threat to the USSR. This assessment, likely informed by the Spanish Civil War, the Austrian Anschluss, and the Sudetenland crisis, probably left Stalin feeling ambivalent about the need for a collective security agreement with Britain and France at that time against Nazi Germany, and lays the groundwork for the treaty that the Soviets will sign a year later in August of 1939 with Nazi Germany. Effectively, what Stalin is saying, and he verbalizes this more precisely in 1939 to members of the Politburo, is that it's just fine if the capitalist countries have another world war amongst themselves. This will allow the Soviet Union an opportunity to finish another 5-year plan and be the last man standing, as it were. All right, so this, and here's the beginning of chapter 12, which begins with a huge exposition on this international struggle. Unfortunately, his handwriting isn't terribly clear here, but he's already filling out a new outline for the beginning of chapter 12. He'll just simply remove the whole thing and create a new argument around how the Soviet Union will stand aside from this new imperialist war. So finally, my last area of analysis for you is the cult of personality. To what extent does Stalin alter the overall profile of his own personality cult in the text? You'll remember that when Khrushchev denounces this text in 1956 at the 20th Party Conference, he argued that Stalin had deliberately had the short course exaggerate Stalin's profile in party history. This contention quickly became popular at home and abroad, as I outlined earlier on, as it seemed to confirm all of the egotistical things that we associate with Stalin and especially the personality cult. Even before I began this project with Zelenov, there were some cracks in this edifice, in this larger theory. New research in the former archives in the 1990s and early 2000s by people like Sarah Davies over in the UK, Jan Plomper, who's now in the UK as well, have demonstrated that Stalin was frequently irritated with the excesses of the personality cult. It wasn't something that appears to have satisfied him at all times. In particular, he got frustrated with propaganda that was focused too tightly on his own personality at the expense of larger party dynamics. So he didn't like that sort of attention on his personality, his idiosyncrasies, or his personal background. He famously told Bulgakov that a play couldn't be developed on his childhood, for instance. There are other such examples. Stalin's editing of the short course supports this analysis, that he had sort of a quixotic relationship to the cult. Yaroslavsky and Pospelov, of course, as loyal Stalinist historians, developed a prototype textbook that generally conformed to what Khrushchev characterized the latter product as, insofar as it attributed a vast amount of historical agency to the General Secretary. Particularly after Lenin's death in 1924, the manuscript credited Stalin with almost everything of any significance in party history. When Stalin turned to vetting the short course in the summer of 1938, he objected to the centrality of his own biography within this party history. Evidence suggests that Stalin regarded his personality cult and the one surrounding Lenin to be a necessary evil of sorts, a concession to an ill-educated Soviet population that was unable to make sense of unadulterated Marxism-Leninism. That is, the leaders' biographies were an entry point or a mechanism for people to understand Marxism, since Marxism is too abstract and schematic for much of the population to master on its own. Indeed, Stalin believed that his role in Soviet mass culture was to personify the party vanguard that was leading the Soviet Union towards socialism. It wasn't a personality cult at all, after all. In other words, the personality had nothing to do with it. He was merely the human personification of progressive Soviet politics. Inasmuch as the short course had been written for a more sophisticated audience of party members, Stalin questioned the prototype's tendency to attribute everything in party history to him. In his view, his readership could handle a more orthodox approach to Marxism-Leninism. For that reason, during his editing of the textbook, he repeatedly reassigned historical agency in the text which had been given to him, and attributed major party decisions either to Lenin or, even more interestingly, to the central party apparatus as a whole. The central party apparatus benefits so much from this reassignment of historical agency that it almost has to be seen as something that Stalin does at his own expense in the text. These editorial interventions result in the excision of passages, paragraphs, and entire pages from the manuscript. Ultimately, Stalin removed so much about himself from the short course that the authors of the text, Yaroslavsky and Pospelov, actually write him letters in August saying, "Do you realize you've cut yourself out of party history? Do you think this is a good idea? We object. This is actually the only objection that the two authors make on a principle level to Stalin's changes in the short course. They object to him removing entire subsets of the text. This is Stalin's struggle for the preservation and strengthening of the illegal Bolshevik organization in the Transcaucasus in the pre-revolutionary period. He decides it's irrelevant to party history and removes the whole thing. He removes every moment of his agency from the first 3 chapters of the text and then continues onward after that. Okay. That's not to say, of course, that when the short course appears in print, it had been entirely purged of its commentary on Stalin. Even after such extensive editing, the text remained a product of its times. But Stalin's editing of the book reveals that his personality cult was intended to do more than just indulge his ego. It was intended to serve as an instrumental, mobilizational text, something that would not necessarily be deployed to flatter the General Secretary, but instead mobilize Soviet society. So what are my conclusions? I have a couple of conclusions, and I'm eager to actually turn the floor over to you and see what you think of this argument. In conclusion, I've argued that the editing of the 1938 short course reveals it to be nothing less than Stalin's master narrative on party history. I've outlined for you 6 key junctures in Soviet history where he absolutely pivots the narrative. In at least a dozen others related to class, gender, nationality, youth, regionalism, foreign affairs, the entire pre-revolutionary period, I think there's a lot more to be discovered in this text. So I think in some senses I've only scratched the surface. My presentation today suggests that by 1938, Stalin was thinking of party history almost exclusively in domestic, autarkic, vanguardist terms. Under the influence of Stalin's red pen, socialist internationalism and the struggle with the opposition gave way to the all-important struggle to build socialism in one country and unify society rather than divide it. I've also argued that although Stalin ought to be considered one of the most influential Soviet historians of the 20th century, he did not, as Khrushchev, Tucker, and others have argued, rewrite party history around himself in his own autobiography. That's not to deny that Stalin was a shameless narcissist. Indeed, he may well have enjoyed many of the hallelujahs sung in his name. However, during his editing of this all-important text, he intentionally reassigned some of the agency initially assigned to him to others, particularly to Lenin and the Central Party apparatus, as a way of diversifying credit within party history and really creating an institutional history of the party rather than an adjunct to the personality cult. There are 2 other big questions that might be worth mentioning before I conclude. First of all, what does Stalin's editing of the short course say about Soviet ideology writ large? In terms of ideology, I think the short course demonstrates Stalinism to have been a natural extension of Leninism, rather than a deviation of some sort as Khrushchev proposed. A true believer, Stalin used Lenin's authority to essentialize Marxism's broad and diverse tradition of thought into a handful of key concepts: vanguardism, socialism in one country, the struggle with the opposition, etc., etc. True, this editing was in many ways clumsy, and was done in a way that left the ideology strikingly hierarchical, doctrinaire, and even parochial. But that didn't distort the Leninist essence of the overall argument. Second, what's the influence of the short course today? At first glance, there is none. The Russian textbook market today appears to have broken with Soviet censorship in the Soviet past and is comprised of books that write openly and honestly about the crimes, excesses, and exigencies of the Stalin period. They're remarkably honest. That said, a closer examination reveals countervailing tendencies. First, the textbook market in Russia today is officially monopolized by 3 state-approved textbooks, something that looks an awful lot like the short course's own monopoly after 1938. So there's a new official historical canon for the Putin period defined by these 3 major officially approved textbooks. Second, and they are based on the same historical standard, that is, they have the same outline. They're written by 3 authorial collectives, but they're the same textbook, same plot line. Second, many of these canons' key themes, the importance of state authority, the necessity of central control over the economy, and the overall positive nature of shock programs of industrialization or mass collectivization, turn out to harken back to the short course. That is, these textbooks speak approvingly in the long run of many of these major transformational programs of the Stalin period. Other themes in the Putin canon, like the correctitude of leadership from above and the suspicious nature of changes from below, also evoke the short course. Now, of course, it is possible to challenge this set of conclusions by suggesting that there are contradictions out there. For instance, if you look at the situation a little bit more broadly today, one notices that many post-Soviet historians, especially the most successful ones working at the Institute of History associated with the Russian Academy of Sciences, are determined these days to downplay the revolutionary past and link Putin's Russia to great power traditions of the pre-revolutionary period. This would seem to contradict reminiscent or nostalgic thoughts in regard to the short course. Indeed, it should probably come as no surprise in this nature that revolutionary slogans like "Workers of the World Unite" did not receive official endorsement or even a lot of coverage 2 years ago during the centennial commemoration of the October 1917 revolution in 2017. In fact, there were no official celebrations. There was a lot of mixed feeling in society. Television programs tended to look askance at October rather than celebrate it. At first glance, this would seem to challenge my argument that the short course is relevant today, insofar as this would seem to be a revisionist position, an anti-Soviet position that would challenge the pro-Soviet narrative of the short course. I'd argue, though, that it's better to look at the Putin-era historical agenda as designed to shift public attention from the international to the national, from radical revolution to more reasoned reformism, and from the power of the street to the power of the state. In that sense, the official themes in the new historical canon of the Putin period are not new, and instead echo the etatist, autarkic, vanguardist themes that underscored Stalin's master narrative and are deeply embedded in the lessons that he thought were valuable to Soviet society in 1938. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we have time for questions from the floor.
Please.
This is kind of a broad question, so however you might be able to answer it. But how do you think that Stalin's edits, or like the narrative he's putting forward, might have been different if this was written in, 1945 or sometime after the war?
David, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question is, to what extent are these edits chronologically a hallmark of 1938? And would they have been different if he had done it in 1945? It's a great question. It, in fact, it in a sense, uncovers a real problem with this text, which is that the Soviet Union goes through World War II between 1941 and 1945, doesn't revise this text, though. So this text remains in circulation through, certainly through the end of Stalin's reign, but up through 1956 without a chapter on World War II. If he had decided to revise this text in 1945, I think that he would have tried to connect some of the struggles of the 1930s to the victory in 1945. Probably he would have diminished the struggle with the opposition even further. And instead, he would have drawn forward some of the investments in heavy industry which are responsible for tank production, for industrial mobilization, for technological advancements during the war. It's really interesting, though, that you asked the question, because he is challenged by this idea. The Institute of Marxism-Leninism, Stalinism attempts to publish a second edition of this text in the late 1940s, and they send him pre-prepared chapters, which will explain World War II, explain the mobilizational period between 1938 and 1941. And there, he barely marks the pages up at all. And I wondered about this because they send him repeated versions of these things. They desperately want to update the party canon. And Zelenov and I think, are concluding that he actually didn't know what to do with the post-war period. Too many changes had happened during World War II. So much of this story sort of culminates in 1938 with the defeat of the opposition and the preparation to build socialism. It's really so hard to connect those interwar stories with victory in 1945 and the struggles that are required to deliver that victory, that he seems to just not know what to do. And so even though he's repeatedly proposed, repeatedly asked to update this text and either to approve what other people have written or write something himself, he leaves it until next day, until next week. And when he dies in 1953, and when they inventory his dacha in the spring of 1953, they find a copy of the short course in his safe with those papers wadded in at the end. So he was apparently still concerned about it, but unable to make a decision about how to proceed with the broad historical narrative.
Thanks for this amazing talk. It's such an amazing project. I had a bit of curiosity about timing of his downplaying of his own role.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned 1917, early Soviet period. Is it the same after 24? In other words, is he just thinking, okay, back then it was Lenin and the Central Committee, but once socialism in one country is built, it's really Stalin, and that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Or did you find the same kinds of downgrading, and upgrading of the Central Committee's role or the party's role as a whole, the vanguard, let's say, without Stalin personally, after 24, even up into the 30s? Because that's really interesting.
It's a great question about periodization. So was he showing some caginess or some difference of opinion about the personality cult any earlier than 38, right? 1924, 1929, 1932, 34, etc. No. Interestingly, so that we know from the history, and other people have done this work, I didn't do this work, Stalin's personality cult maybe launches at his 50th birthday in December of 29. It really comes online in about 1932. He becomes just a feature front page newspaper all the time after 1933, 34. But the personality cult is cresting in the middle of the 1930s. And this goes hand in hand with a new style of Soviet propaganda which focuses on dynamic individuals. It moves away from the language of class and the schematicism and structuralism of early Soviet propaganda based on materialism and features people front and center in the 1930s. So the personality cult makes a lot of sense in the mid-1930s as the paragon of this greater focus on Soviet heroism. So interestingly, I think that the shift in 38 is really dramatic and unexpected. That is, Pospelov and Yaroslavsky submit this thing, which is absolutely as bad as Khrushchev said it probably was. In fact, though they actually delivered that product. It is absolutely Stalin-centric, what they delivered to him in April of 38. And he, I think, decides that this is just not the way to move forward. In fact, he has to strip a number of other personalities out of the short course as well, and delivers up an institutional history rather than a more personal history of Bolshevism.
That answers my question a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your talk. I was interested in part it seems that what we're given is a story of change, the change of history, like a master narrative that needs to always be rewritten, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the beginning of the purchase is one story, 37, 38 is another story. So the editor's hands, like, well, I'll always need to be tossing things out. And I'm wondering though, because I mean the argument to me seems to focus so much on the global personality. I'm wondering to what extent, and again this goes back to the question you just answered, that we have differences in this versus, I mean, how much are we getting a reinterpretation of the global personality generally? And part of what makes me, part of what your argument makes me wonder is, I mean, the historians that are seeing in the short course a cult of personality that doesn't seem to be there, right? Is this kind of suggesting that the way in which a cult of personality might be a kind of a dumping ground for the Stalinist era, where pulling out actually like the vanguardist autocratic kind of thing that's actually really going on as one way that's okay, no, that's personality versus the way to say, no, that's what that is, but this is something else. I mean, part of that seems to be going on to me a little bit with what you're arguing. I mean, I'm wondering if you agree with that or where you're.
So I think your observation. So your question, there was a lot in there, but I think the core question is to what extent is the personality cult the sum total or the guiding force of a lot of this editing? Is there anything else going on in there, and why the focus on the personality cult? More or less.
Is your argument that we ought to reconsider, and by we I mean historians who read the short course and said, no, this is just a personality. I mean, what is this work doing to help us reinterpret the way that the concept is used?
Yes, so it would be fascinating in some senses to publish both of these things side by side to allow people to sort of sample the full chapters. In a sense, you can do it by looking at the extracted text or the crossed out text to see what the previous version was, what Yaroslavsky and Pospielov delivered. But I think you're right that if you compare the two, if you compare the truly personality cult short course that arrives on Stalin's desk in April of '38 with the version which he delivers to Pravda in September, there's enough of a difference to begin to really re-problematize what the personality cult does. I would be overselling my point to say that the personality cult is not in the short course. It's been diminished. It's still quite prominent. It's still an artifact of its time. However, it allows a lot more interest in industrialization, in technocracy, in especially the leading role of the party. Why is that? I think part of the argument, and Stalin says this very clearly to Pospielov in 1946, Stalin views the personality cult as an entree into ideology. It's a way to get into ideology for people who have third and fourth grade educations and can't read Capital yet, can't even read the Communist Manifesto. So they enter into it through the personality of leaders. This was a big deal during the mid-1930s. And so it probably shouldn't be too much of a surprise that the front page of every newspaper has Stalin on it. It shouldn't be too much of a surprise that all the party grammars had Stalin interpenetrated through them. Even the short course has Stalin in its prototype version. But I think that something that you might be touching on or suspecting is that Stalin is trying to change the nature of party indoctrination with the short course. He's interested in doing more than just relying on the personality cult. And in fact, what I suggest in that earlier book that I wrote on propaganda state and crisis is that party ideology is supposed to bifurcate after 1938. For the more poorly educated members of society, the personality cult will remain center. And there will be an official biography of Stalin published in 1939, which he is also involved in. It's designed for lower audiences with a lower exposure to philosophy and especially Marxism-Leninism. But for the higher party, Stalin now has the idea that enough of that surrogate work, we need to actually encourage a mastery of actual philosophy. And at the same time that people are thinking about materialism and historical materialism, they should think about more realistic ways of administering a state, of running a 5-year plan, about getting ready for war. And that requires a trust placed in the party apparatus and a willingness to accept command not just from Stalin, but from Kaganovich, from Malenkov, from the other Bolshevik party hierarchs. So I think that there's a bifurcation which happens that begins with this text. It's an incomplete bifurcation because it closes down right after the start of the war. So it's sort of a lost project in some senses, but it suggests that the personality cult gives some way in this text in order to allow for other forms of indoctrination and to begin to expose the audiences who are reading this book to a greater, less adulterated version of Marxism-Leninism. A couple of other themes that are worth mentioning in this text. This text suggests, when Stalin's finished with it, that collectivization is planned more accurately. Industrialization is done also more with greater care and less of a shotgun approach. The original prototype that Yaroslavsky and Pospielov wrote had described industrialization as a response to the struggle with the opposition. Collectivization was a response to the struggle with the kulaks. Stalin isn't so comfortable with that because he believes in a scientific sort of Marxism in which the party is thinking ahead. It's a proactive vision of history rather than a reactive vision. So he also, at the same time that he's pushing, he's asking the personality cult to share center stage with the party apparatus, he's also asking people to begin thinking about industrialization as less shotgun, less panicky, and more planned. It's a sign of a planned economy. It's a sign of scientific socialism rather than panic in the face of Trotskyites and Bukharinites. It's a great question. So Khrushchev needed to do a variety of things in 1956. Oh yeah, so what is Khrushchev's motivation for denouncing, I guess, both Stalin and, of course, the Stalin short course? And there are a couple of answers to this, obviously, but Khrushchev inherits a Soviet Union which is very ossified. It's a society in which The key party canon hasn't been updated since 1938. It's difficult to imagine how to update it. Even after Stalin's death, they begin to imagine updating this text. They don't imagine replacing it. They just figure that they'll add those chapters in finally. But even that they aren't able to do in the span of 53 to 38. And so it appears as if Khrushchev's decision in 56 is one that he almost singularly takes. And he takes it as a way of sort of breaking up the ossification of this party apparatus. We know for a fact that in December of 55, it's Khrushchev who asks poor Pospelov, who's sort of much older and higher ranking at this point. He tells Pospelov that Pospelov must go and investigate the Stalin excesses of the Great Terror. And Pospelov is not very happy about this task. Pospelov is Stalinist among Stalinists. He does, on the eve of this 20th Party Congress, bring a report to the Bolshevik High Command, the party High Command, reporting in fairly skeletal, bare-bone terms what the scale of the repressions were. The Politburo is aghast by the scale of it. Nobody had ever thought to quantify, especially the number of leading lights who are cut down. And Khrushchev says, all right, we have to tell the Congress. The Congress is, or the rest of the Politburo is very unhappy with this idea, do not want to share this information, require that Khrushchev will balance the negative information with more positive reiteration of Stalin's contributions. Khrushchev says, okay. He shows them a text that he's going to use. They reluctantly, I guess, approve it. And then he sits down with Shpilyev, or Shlepin, and rewrites it, and expands the indictment of Stalin in much greater terms than had been approved by the Presidium, and goes forward with it. So Khrushchev sincerely believes that it is necessary to break up the Stalinist monopoly on Soviet political life. The short course has to go at the same time that the Stalinist monopoly is being broken up, because the short course is so deeply tied to that whole edifice. Khrushchev imagines that there will be new party histories released the following year, that party life will come alive once you remove the heavy baggage of dead Stalin, and that's indeed what he appears to have hoped. Now, the substitution that he offers is fairly clumsy. It's a revival of Leninism, rather than any new set of particularly great ideas. Khrushchev is not much of an ideologue. He's pretty good at certain sorts of policy, or at least he fancies himself as an administrator and an executive, but he's not a theoretician. And so they do remove the short course from circulation at the same time that Stalin is denounced in 56. However, they really struggled. Polly Jones has written a terrific book on this, on the struggles to replace the Stalinist center of Soviet ideology with something else during the tail end of the thaw. This is something that happens over 2 years' time. The first texts that emerge are thin and not very successful. And ultimately what you get is almost a one-for-one relationship in which Stalin is replaced by Central Committee, Stalin is replaced by Central Committee, Stalin is replaced by Central Committee, and many of the other tendencies that are identified in the short course remain. And that's why I argue that the lasting effect of this text is considerable even after 1956, even after it disappears from people's shelves and disappears from the syllabus in party schools. It's still the go-to. It has still set up the narrative, which remains more or less in place, with the exception of Stalin, until the Gorbachev period.
Yeah, this one was the last question. What struck me about your talk was just how, having read this in grad school as you did, and these histories of the Communist Party over time, you think of them as kind of long-term projects, really. What struck me about your talk was how extraordinarily just how extraordinarily located in 1938 as a historical moment. Nationalism, decline of internationalism, impending war, purges and all this. And I don't like pathologizing a person's character or mindset from the text. So let me ask you, see if you can pathologize. Is there a certain pathology going on? You talked about at one point about this was an attempt or evidence of Stalin diversifying credit for Bolshevik party history. What if he's diversifying blame for this moment in history in 1938, in the sense that he feels threatened? And the reason I started with this was because just the extraordinary extraordinary violence of some of his editing.
Mhm.
It's not sort of in between the lines, it's right across. Do you do anything with that in terms of kind of interpreting kind of as uncomfortable as you are, personal pathology? Imagine we did.
Right. Okay, so the question was, what does 1938 mean here? And Professor Corney's wagering or offering the hypothesis that maybe Stalin is interested in sharing some of the credit for this disaster with the party hierarchy. I guess my answer would be twofold here. In regard to collectivization, probably. Popular memory of collectivization is not a happy one in 1938. It's too close. And to put the party in charge of collectivization distances Comrade Stalin from personal responsibility. I think one can say the same thing about shock industrialization, though he has a decent role in the chapters there. So I think that's a pretty good argument in regard to collectivization, and the peasantry is so large in the Soviet Union that this would be a major cause of issue. The other thing that I would say, though, and I've explored this one a little bit more, is that the temporality of Stalin's edits, I think, relate to his amateur nature as a historian. I do think that he's one of the most influential Soviet historians of the 20th century, but he's not a good historian. And his editing is actually rather poor. He believes, and I don't know how many of you have ever done a sustained edit on something, but he believes you can linearly edit a book. You can begin on page 1 and edit straight through, and then you're done. When professional editors edit books, they rearrange, they cut and paste, they rethink, they ask authors to return to it, and there's a lot of reconceptualization that goes on. But Stalin has a very superficial idea of what editing is. He covers this book with comments, but he doesn't rethink things in a way which causes text to be moved around. And so as a result, it turns out to be sort of a hodgepodge. In the end, it's not a very good book. It reads absolutely turgidly. In some senses, the version that Yaroslavsky and Pospelov wrote was better. It was more paranoid. It did all sorts of things that Stalin didn't want it to do, but it was written by professional historians. And it had that bigger sort of idea in mind about, in this case, the struggle with the opposition. Stalin wasn't very good at inserting the red thread back in, or a new red thread about socialism in one country. It's heavy-handed in places. It disappears in other places. He's not very good at that sort of editing. And he also sort of selectively removes things in a way which creates some uncomfortable moments that his attention is alerted to these things later on in the editorial process. Somebody will say, Comrade Stalin, you haven't explained who this person is, because he cut out the previous chapter. Or Comrade Stalin, the dates don't line up anymore because you've removed too much of the narrative. He refuses to change any of it because he's already committed himself and just decides to steamroll forward. But so in some senses, the temporality of this book's fixation with 1938 has to do, I think, a lot with the fact that he's an amateur. He's we'd call him a news junkie today. He's absolutely obsessed with 1938, and for him, he's going to draw all teleological strings in the book forward to 38. He's not thinking about anything further, and he's very happy to be standing in 38 rather than 1935 or 34, or God forbid, 1933.
Let's thank our speakers.
Thank you very much.